It's me, Oppenheimer. It's Oppenheiming time.
I'm gonna be honest, I didn't plan on reviewing Oppenheimer. Not only did a ghost decide to have his way with my throat for 3 weeks, leading to a complete voice loss,
Yamaha, Nikon, Casio, Iwa.
but the only theater near me showing it in 70mm IMAX was booked solid until precisely July 31st at 10 a.m., almost 2 weeks after the release date. Alas, upon finally seeing it in all its glory, I'm here to confidently say that Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer is a breathtaking biopic that was well worth every second of its 180-minute runtime. And given where my reviews usually end up, you can say that's a pretty rare critique from little ol' me. Based on the 2005 biography American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, Nolan's adapted screenplay follows J. Robert Oppenheimer through the early days of his career as first a professor, then a leading scientist on the infamous Manhattan Project, of which his work there earned him the title of the grandfather of the atomic bomb. On a budget of $100 million and up against what has been an unexpected box office powerhouse, Oppenheimer is faring incredibly well and continuing to kill it 2 weeks later. With the recent approval in the Chinese market, Nolan's previous infamy in the country, and, well, history, I imagine this film will get a second win once that market opens up. Oppenheimer opens with a shot of young Oppie, played by Cillian Murphy, and interspersed with shots of the atomic explosions to come later, with the line, "Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. For this, he was chained to a rock and tortured for eternity." An allusion to the general plot of the film that follows for the next 3 hours. The film briefly skates over his beginnings in quantum physics, how he sought to bring it to the US, and successfully did, by teaching a course at Berkeley in California. It's here that his ties begin to grow, with further academic connections being made, as well as his political interests expanding into the realms of communism. It's these early political interests that end up driving the underlying plot of the film, how Oppenheimer's political pastimes influenced not only the government's interests in him leading major nuclear projects, but also his faithfulness to the United States during that same time period. Aside from his brother and sister joining the party for a brief time, Oppie's on and off affair with Jean Tatlock, played by Florence Pugh, a Berkeley professor and known Communist Party member, Oppie's moral convictions also drove the government to question how loyal he really was. In order to accurately dramatize the events at the Los Alamos laboratory and the government scrutinization Oppenheimer was facing, Nolan presents both stories interwoven with each other and uses a pretty distinct use of color that I honestly can't recall him using since Memento. As we see a young Oppie learn, develop, and finally blow his first atomic bomb in the desert, the film is visually saturated, a reflection I found of not only the dense work being carried through, but also the intense developments happening in his personal life, with his marriage to Kitty Punig, played by Emily Blunt, whom was still married when they got together, the difficulties of raising his first 2 children, and the conflicting interests of his younger brother and sister-in-law. The legal and government proceedings against Oppenheimer are instead in complete black and white, not only to help audiences outline which time they're in, but also, for the majority of the film, to show off how black and white the entire proceedings are, which attempt to paint Oppie as untrustworthy. It's not until the final act of the film, which these black and white proceedings divulge into color, albeit not as saturated as before, that we as the audience understand the government's doings are far more nefarious than initially led to believe. The weaving of this really narrative-rich storytelling is all supported by a truly haunting score by Ludwig Göransson, who you've probably heard in another Nolan film I admittedly have really struggled to watch more than 10 minutes of, Tenet.
What? What the
The cinematography is a sight to behold, adequately catching the deserts of America and the life of an academic, all supported by an absolute lack of CGI effects that is beyond appreciated, and a treat in itself for the brain. Additionally, the phenomenal casting of the entire cast is near perfect. Cillian Murphy genuinely delivers the performance of his career. Every shot of him, whether it was when he fell in love with Kitty or was enamored by work or jilted by those around him, was enticing. His portrayal of Oppenheimer as he transitions from pure wonder in nuclear physics to facing the ethical dilemmas presented by the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a whirlwind in itself and something that ranks this film as breathtaking just for his performance alone. The gaze Murphy carries throughout genuinely penetrates you and will draw you to the edge of the seat. The supporting characters do justice to the real-world individuals they portray as well. The only actor I really could have taken or left was Robert Downey Jr., and that's simply because his role could have been played by virtually anyone. But his whole vegan chic look worked pretty well for a dill-hole government official. The biggest issue Oppenheimer faces, which from conversations seemed to split the audience, is the way the film is edited. Nolan has long been a questionable director in his choice of edits by the film community. His most notable film, The Dark Knight, while being breathtaking in its own right, is pretty horrendously edited together when you really pay attention to the way the plot and characters unfold. Depending on who's watching Oppenheimer, it can be looked at through this similar lens. Given how much is being condensed into this film, Oppenheimer suffers from a lot of quick jump cuts that can easily lose its audience. These fast edits shatter the general timeline and scale in which everything is happening. So unless you're paying critical attention to the dialogue, which sometimes is pretty hard to hear, another Nolan trait, it would be easy to miss that there's a span of 10 to 15 years being covered in the first half of the film alone. That being said, there are moments where Nolan acknowledges that the pacing needs to slow down, and it's most evident in the sequence where Los Alamos carries out their first successful nuclear test. On top of being the best reason to see this movie on the big screen, you could feel the tension and excitement through each and every character throughout this almost 10-minute scene, and goodness, did it actually have me looking like one of those guys out of the Ark opening scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The editing brings me to one of the few personal critiques I have of this film, the first of which might be a hot take. I wanted this movie to be longer.
I can see that got your attention.
Compared to Barbie, which actually felt 3 hours long, Oppenheimer flew by because I was truly engrossed in every minute of it. And I know some will say that the first half going through Oppie's beginnings was kind of meh, but my former engineering brain loved seeing famous scientists like Niels Bohr come to life on a major motion picture release. And I'm also a shoo-in for well-dramatized biopics. Alas, I do feel that the first half there was a lot skimmed over that would have benefited greatly from having a longer runtime. Specifically, Oppie's interest in communism, which was a huge part of the overall plot. His personal interest was glossed over for the sake of instead having it highlighted by his brother, sister-in-law, and Jean, but even their interest seemed vague at the very least. Perhaps that's intentional given what Hollywood likes to promote, but this lack of exploration really undercuts the legal and government proceedings that make up half the movie. Additionally, Emily Blunt as Kitty was critically underdeveloped in this film, and there are many instances, primarily in the second half, that allude to a longer version existing at some point. Aside from the whole 11 miles of film reel detail. Kitty was clearly a very big contrasting perspective to how the government proceedings were perceived by Oppenheimer, and their loosely unconventional marriage had a large impact on not only Oppie, but how the pair interacted with each other as husband and wife. I would have loved to see more exploration of their marriage, as Kitty was very clearly portrayed as much more than a housewife and a mother, and equally a female character that was genuinely equal parts strong and feminine in nature. I guess you can take that with a grain of salt though, because I also really like Emily Blunt. One of the biggest talking points of Oppenheimer, aside from its release alongside Barbie, was unsurprisingly Florence Pugh's nudity. Generally, when it's a hot dude or hot female, I just don't care for nudity in film and TV, as it's usually used as nothing more than shock. Christopher Nolan was very adamant in stating that Pugh's nudity was necessary to the plot, and in a rare instance, I can maybe see where his point is. Pugh has 3 instances of major nudity. The first is when her and Oppie hook up initially, which was just kinda cringe because she's riding him with her breast bare while she's reading a line from the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh yes, it was horrible, I tell you.
The second instance is later on post-coital, in which we see both her and Cillian Murphy sitting naked in chairs adjacent from each other. The entire way the scene plays out, both in the dialogue and visually, is clearly meant to showcase the vulnerability that Oppenheimer not only feels with Jean, but to equally highlight how naked he feels under the microscope of the government due to the whole investigating communism stuff. The last instance she appears naked is during the private hearings, in which upon diving into Oppie's affair with Jean while he was married to Kitty, Kitty envisions a naked Jean atop of Oppie in a state of ecstasy. A shot that is meant to showcase that same emotional nakedness while they're having their marriage bared for all, but to also show the innate jealousy that Kitty feels in knowing that her husband sought comfort from another woman. This third instance honestly just reinforces that exploring their marriage more would have been beneficial, but in combination combination with the other instances of nudity, there are definitely ways that these same vulnerabilities could have been showcased without having to resort to full frontal nudity. So in that sense, I would describe the nudity in Oppenheimer as gratuitous for the sake of it, especially since it takes advantage of a highly appreciated female actress that men do adore. So in conclusion, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer is a powerhouse of a film. It's a narrative-rich biopic that, while extremely heavy on dialogue and discussions, is still visually stunning and engrossing. While the film definitely could have explored certain areas of Oppenheimer's life and influences more, and perhaps that's a discussion more for whether it could have been an adapted limited series instead of a film, I'm glad I waited to see it in 70mm IMAX, as Oppenheimer is a unique cinematic experience meant for the big screen. It's not Christopher Nolan's best, but it certainly ranks as one of his better films in all the ways that matter. And I genuinely look forward to seeing him hopefully explore more biographical films in the future. If you can, and if your ass can stay seated for more than 3 hours, Oppenheimer is worth the trip to the cinema. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for stopping by and stay frosty, friends.